Sophie sat on the edge of her bed, the soft glow of her phone screen casting a faint light in the otherwise dim room. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between doubt and a strange feeling of anticipation. She had been chatting with Alex for the past 3 months. He had become a constant presence in her life, a comforting voice that helped her navigate through the sorrow and grief after losing James. Sophie hadn't planned to connect with anyone, let alone someone she'd met online. But somehow, through late-night conversations and shared vulnerabilities, Alex had become a lifeline, someone who truly understood her pain. She had never met him in person, never seen his face except for a few blurry photos that he had shared. But his words, his compassion, had been real. Sophie had grown fond of him, and in the quiet moments between the waves of grief, she had allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she could move on, one small step at a time. But she still wasn't ready to face the reality of meeting him. It felt like a betrayal to James. How could she go on dates, meet someone new, when the person she had promised to spend forever with was no longer there? The thought of replacing James felt impossible, even though she knew she couldn't stay frozen in time forever. She had tried to go on with life, but her heart kept pulling her back to memories of him. His laugh, his touch, the warmth of his embrace. The notification on her phone made her jump. It was a message from Alex. He had been gentle with her, never rushing her, always understanding. He had noticed the hesitation in her texts, the moments when she seemed distant. Yet he had never pressured her. "Are you sure you're ready?" he had asked, his message soft and full of understanding. "I'll wait for you, no matter how long it takes. But when you're ready, I'll be here. And no matter what happens, I'll always be just a message away." Sophie bit her lip. She had been telling herself that she was ready, that maybe meeting Alex could be the first step in healing, in reclaiming a part of herself she had lost. The grief had been all-consuming for so long, and now, after all these months, she realized that she needed something more. She needed a connection outside of the past, something that could remind her that life wasn't all sorrow and loss. With a deep breath, Sophie typed her reply. "Let's meet. I think it's time." She had chosen a quiet cafe, tucked away from the busyness of the city, a place where she could feel safe. It was a small, intimate spot with soft lighting and comfortable seating, a neutral ground, the kind of place where people could talk without feeling the weight of the world pressing down on them. Sophie was nervous, her heart pounding in her chest as she got ready to leave her apartment. The butterflies in her stomach wouldn't stop fluttering. She had no idea what to expect or how it would feel to meet someone who had become so important to her, yet remained a stranger. But she couldn't keep putting it off. She had to take this step, even if it terrified her. She carefully selected her outfit, wanting to feel comfortable yet put together. She chose a soft blue dress, the one that James had always loved, the one that made her feel a little less broken. It was a color he had always said brought out the blue in her eyes. Sophie hesitated before putting it on, feeling the weight of the memories attached to the dress. But it was just a dress. She couldn't let it hold her back from moving forward. As she walked out the door, Sophie felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. The grief still lingered, a constant companion, but now there was something else, an unfamiliar sensation. Hope. She didn't want to admit it, but the idea of having someone in her life again, someone who cared, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in months. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet streets as she made her way to the cafe. The sky was a dull gray, but there was a promise of something brighter, something new, in the air. It was a crisp winter afternoon, and the cool breeze nipped at her skin. Sophie wrapped her coat tighter around herself, trying to block out the cold. As she walked, her mind raced with questions. What would Alex be like in person? Would he still be the same person she had come to know through the screen? Or was she about to meet a stranger, someone who didn't fit the image she had built up in her mind? But as she approached the cafe, Sophie couldn't stop the surge of curiosity that bubbled up inside her. She felt both scared and hopeful, uncertain and excited all at once. She was about to take a step into a new chapter of her life, and she couldn't predict what that would look like. All she knew was that it had to start somewhere. Sophie pushed open the door to the cafe, the warmth inside greeting her like a soft embrace. The sound of quiet chatter and the hum of espresso machines filled the air. But for a moment, it all faded into the background as she scanned the room. Her gaze settled on a figure sitting at a corner table, his attention fixed on a menu, his posture relaxed yet confident. And then he looked up. For a brief moment, Sophie couldn't breathe. Her heart stopped. The man sitting at the table, Alex, looked eerily like James. Not just a passing resemblance, but something deeper, more unsettling. The same strong jawline, the same dark eyes, the same gentle smile that seemed to reach his eyes. It was as if she was looking at a ghost. A ghost that was not James, but someone who shared his features with haunting accuracy. Sophie stood frozen for a moment, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She had heard that people could look alike, that there were doppelgangers out there. But this felt different. She had expected Alex to look like himself, like the man she had gotten to know through the messages and texts. But this was not just a man who resembled James. This was someone who seemed to carry his very essence. Her breath caught in her throat, and she swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. She forced herself to move forward, her legs shaking slightly beneath her. When she finally reached his table, Alex looked up and smiled, his expression warm, welcoming. But it was the smile of someone she didn't know, someone who on the surface seemed familiar, but who was now a stranger. "Sophie?" he asked, his voice soft and full of kindness. "I'm so glad you came." Sophie tried to smile, but it felt brittle, forced. "Alex?" she whispered, almost as if she were testing the name on her lips. The name felt wrong somehow, like it didn't belong to the person sitting before her. Alex nodded, his smile widening. "It's me, Alex. I'm really glad you're here." His voice was smooth, comforting, but it didn't sound like the man she had spent countless nights talking to. This was a stranger, wearing the face of someone she had loved deeply. Sophie's pulse quickened, and for a moment she was overwhelmed by the need to flee. How could this be real? How could he look so much like James? She tried to push the thoughts away, to focus on the fact that this was Alex, not James. But the resemblance was too uncanny, too undeniable. She tried to force her thoughts into some kind of order, but the memories of James, their life together, his laugh, the way his eyes sparkled when he smiled, flooded her mind all at once, leaving her breathless. Sophie began, her voice trembling. You look like someone I used to know." Alex's expression faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, a hint of something unreadable in his eyes. "I'm sure I don't know who you're talking about, but I'm just glad to finally meet you in person." Sophie felt her heart race. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She sat down slowly, trying to ignore the turmoil churning in her stomach. "You're different from what I imagined," she said, forcing herself to speak calmly, but in a good way. "It's just, I didn't expect this." Alex's smile softened. "I guess we're both full of surprises," he said, his voice gentle. "But I'm glad you're here. Let's just enjoy the moment." But Sophie couldn't let go of the unsettling feeling that had settled deep in her chest. Something wasn't right. She had to know more. Sophie sat down across from Alex, her hands trembling slightly in her lap as she tried to gather her thoughts. The cafe, with its soft lighting and the low murmur of conversation around them, seemed to fade into the background. It was as if the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. But the stranger across from her wasn't quite a stranger at all. He looked too much like James. His smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, even the way he leaned forward as he spoke. Everything felt painfully familiar. "Are you okay?" Alex's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts, his brow furrowed with concern. He reached out, placing a hand gently on the table, but it was as if that simple gesture brought everything crashing down around Sophie. The way he moved, the softness in his eyes, it all reminded her of James in a way that was almost unbearable. Sophie swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had to get a grip. This was ridiculous. People didn't look exactly like someone else. There had to be an explanation. But the truth was, nothing made sense. Every fiber of her being screamed that this couldn't be a coincidence, but she couldn't make sense of the emotions swirling within her. "I'm fine," Sophie finally managed to say, forcing a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She picked up her menu and scanned it absently, though her mind was a chaotic mess. How could she talk to him about this? How could she confront him about something so impossible? Alex seemed to sense her unease. "You know," he said softly, almost too casually, "I've always loved jazz. It's one of my favorite things. What about you?" Sophie blinked, caught off guard. Jazz? She could feel her stomach tighten at the mention of it. James had adored jazz. They'd spent hours together in dimly lit clubs, the soft music wrapping around them like a warm embrace. It was one of their things, a shared passion, something that had always made her feel closer to him. And here was Alex, this man who looked so much like James, talking about it as though it were his own love. Her heart raced as the words left her lips before she could stop them. "James loved jazz," she muttered, her voice quieter than she intended. Alex's eyes softened, and for a moment, Sophie swore she saw a flicker of recognition flash in his gaze. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently on the surface of the table, as if in thought. "I've always felt connected to it in a way that words can't explain," he said, his voice laced with a depth of emotion that made Sophie's chest ache. "It's like the music understands you without needing to say anything." Sophie's breath hitched, and for a fleeting moment, she was transported back to the times when James had spoken to her about music the same way. It had always been so natural, so easy for them to talk about their shared interests. But now, sitting across from Alex, the weight of their connection felt hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was drowning in memories she wasn't ready to confront. Sophie's pulse quickened. She couldn't continue this conversation. It felt like a betrayal, yet she couldn't stop herself. Her mind was racing, and the questions she had kept buried now pushed to the surface. "Have we met before?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though the question hung heavily between them. "I don't understand. You're so familiar." Alex's gaze faltered for just a moment, and Sophie saw the subtle shift in his expression. It was as though her words had caught him off guard. But just as quickly, he masked it with that same warm, reassuring smile. "No, Sophie," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something Sophie couldn't quite place. "I'm sure we haven't met before. I'm just a guy who likes to talk about life and share a bit of myself. That's all." But Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was more, much more, hiding behind his words. Something in the way he said it didn't sit right. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't know why, but you feel like someone I used to know, someone I loved." Alex's expression softened, but the flicker of something deeper, something unspoken, lingered in his eyes. "Maybe that's just the connection we've built over these past few months," he said gently. "I know it's been a lot to process. We've shared a lot with each other." But Sophie wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was consumed by the gnawing sensation that she had stumbled upon something she wasn't ready to face. Could it be? Was it possible that this man, this Alex, was somehow connected to her past in a way she couldn't comprehend? She looked at him one more time, trying to push the thought aside, trying to rationalize what she was feeling. But deep inside, she knew that this wasn't just coincidence. This man, the one across from her, was tied to the life she thought she had lost. And Sophie wasn't sure she was ready to discover why. The conversation slowed, the words hanging heavy between them. Sophie tried to focus on the here and now, but the past was a relentless companion, shadowing every moment. Alex seemed to sense her discomfort, his voice becoming more soothing, almost as though he were trying to calm her. "It's okay," he said gently. "You don't have to talk about it if you're not ready. We can just enjoy the moment. Let's talk about something else." Sophie nodded absently, grateful for the change in direction. But as the conversation shifted, something else began to gnaw at her, something that she couldn't ignore. As Alex continued to speak, she noticed the little things, the odd, too close for comfort resemblances to James that seemed to appear at every turn. When they talked about food, Alex mentioned his love for Belgian waffles. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. It was a strange, almost absurd detail, but it was exactly the kind of thing that had been James's favorite. Sophie remembered how they would order waffles together, sitting in cozy cafes on lazy Saturday mornings, savoring each bite while talking about everything and nothing. When Alex mentioned jazz again, Sophie couldn't ignore the way his voice dropped into a tone of reverence, much like James used to when discussing his favorite records. Sophie had always thought that James had a unique way of appreciating music, not just as a background noise, but as something deeply connected to his soul. Her heart was pounding now, the memories crashing over her like a wave she couldn't outrun. She tried to push them away, tried to focus on Alex, the real Alex, the one sitting in front of her. But every word he spoke felt like an echo from the past, like a part of her life that she thought was lost forever. "Do you ever think about fate?" Alex asked suddenly, his voice almost a whisper. "How sometimes things happen for a reason, even if we don't understand why at first?" Sophie looked at him sharply. His words felt loaded with meaning, as though he were trying to tell her something without actually saying it. She didn't know what it was, but the moment the words left his mouth, she felt the air between them shift. Her pulse raced. She couldn't ignore it any longer, the growing sense of familiarity that was seeping into every part of her. "Fate," Sophie echoed, her voice barely audible. I think I'm starting to believe in it." Alex's eyes widened, his gaze intense, as if her words had triggered something inside him. "I don't believe in coincidence," he said, his voice low. "Not anymore." Sophie's heart stopped. Not anymore? The phrase hung in the air, filled with a significance she couldn't quite grasp. The room felt too small, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but found herself unable to form the words. What was happening? Why did it feel like everything in her life was converging on this one moment? Why did she feel like she was standing on the edge of something huge? Something that would change everything she thought she knew. Sophie had never been one to believe in signs, in fate or destiny. She was a woman of logic, of reasoning, of facts. But as she sat there in the cafe, staring at Alex, her mind whirring with the heavy weight of memories she couldn't fully process, she began to wonder if this was more than just a chance meeting. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her coffee cup, trying to steady herself. The flickering candlelight on the table cast soft shadows, but they did nothing to dispel the storm raging inside her. This isn't right, she thought, her heart hammering in her chest. This is too much, too familiar. The entire conversation had been one long string of uncanny similarities. Alex's love for jazz, his quiet demeanor, always thoughtful, always measured like James had been. Even the way he spoke, slow and deliberate, as though each word carried weight and meaning. Sophie couldn't deny it any longer. Something was wrong. Something had been wrong from the moment she'd agreed to meet him. She tried to focus on his words, but all she could think about was the man she had lost, the man who had been taken from her in a cruel twist of fate. James had been her everything. Their love had been effortless, their connection a deep and unspoken bond that transcended words. It had been stolen from her in an instant, a car crash that had shattered her world. But now? Now here she was, sitting across from a man who felt too much like him. Sophie blinked, trying to clear the fog in her mind, but nothing made sense. She stared at Alex's face, his lips, the curve of his jaw, the way he smiled when he talked. It was the same, too similar. This can't be happening, she thought desperately. He can't be. Suddenly, Alex's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Sophie," he said, his tone soft, almost hesitant. "Is everything okay? You've been quiet for a while. You seem distant, like you're somewhere else." Sophie looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. He looked concerned, genuinely so, and yet the familiarity of his expression only unsettled her more. "Why am I doing this?" she asked herself. "Why am I still sitting here?" She opened her mouth to speak, to ask him, "Is there something you're not telling me?" But the words caught in her throat. She couldn't bring herself to voice what she suspected. The idea was too absurd, too painful to even entertain. But at the same time, she couldn't push it away. Every part of her screamed that there was more to Alex than he was letting on, more than he had shared. "Alex," she finally managed to say, her voice hoarse. "Can I ask you something?" He nodded, leaning in a little closer, his eyes full of gentle curiosity. "Anything." Sophie hesitated, searching his face for any sign of what she was about to ask. "Have you ever known anyone named James?" Her heart skipped a beat, her chest tightening with the weight of the question. She felt like she was about to step off a cliff, unsure of whether the ground would catch her or if she would fall into an abyss of confusion and heartbreak. For a long moment, Alex didn't speak. His expression remained unchanged, but Sophie could see the flicker of something in his eyes, something fleeting, something that made her blood run cold. Then, as if nothing had happened, he leaned back in his chair, that familiar smile returning to his lips. "No," he said easily, but Sophie didn't believe him. Her gut told her otherwise. But instead of pushing further, Sophie nodded, accepting the answer she had hoped wasn't true. She didn't want to dig any deeper. Not yet. Not when she was still trying to convince herself that she wasn't imagining things. But her mind raced, her pulse pounding in her ears. Why was he so familiar? Why did his presence feel like a ghost from the past? The more she tried to distance herself from the question, the more the memories of James intruded. The way he had held her close when she cried, how he would brush her hair back from her face and kiss her forehead, telling her that everything would be okay. His voice, his touch, the way his eyes would soften whenever he looked at her, like she was the only person in the world who mattered. And now, here she was, sitting across from someone who seemed to embody all those same qualities. It was too much. It was too real. "Are you sure everything's okay?" Alex's voice brought her back to the present, his gaze searching her face. "You've gone quiet again. If something's bothering you, you can tell me." Sophie's heart lurched in her chest. She wanted to tell him. She wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, to ask him how he could be so much like James. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded again, managing a weak smile. "I'm fine, really, just tired, I guess." Alex seemed to accept that, though Sophie saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't push her further, but the weight of the unspoken question hung in the air between them. Was it possible that her mind was playing tricks on her? That she was projecting all of her grief onto this man sitting before her? Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, trying to steady herself. She didn't know what was happening. She didn't know if she could trust her own thoughts. But one thing was certain. Something about Alex felt too familiar to ignore. The night dragged on, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She made excuses to leave the cafe early, her mind a swirl of confusion and unease. The moment she returned home, she locked herself in her apartment and sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts consumed by the man she had just met. The more she thought about Alex, the more impossible it seemed that he was just another person she had crossed paths with. He was too much like James. Too close. The way his smile had softened when he spoke about jazz, the way he looked at her with those warm eyes, it was like he knew her, like he had always known her. And then there was the way he had reacted when she mentioned James. He had been too calm, too nonchalant, almost as if he had expected the question. Sophie felt a pang in her chest, the memory of James's face flashing in her mind's eye. Her hand hovered over her phone, the temptation to contact Alex almost overwhelming. But something inside her told her that she needed to be sure, that she couldn't just let this go. With shaking hands, Sophie grabbed her laptop from the desk and opened it to search for answers. She had never been one to dive into conspiracy theories or dig into people's lives without reason. But this was different. This wasn't a coincidence. This was something far beyond that. She typed in Alex's name, hoping for a simple answer, a trace of information that would put her mind at ease. But the results were sparse. There was nothing truly significant about him. A few social media profiles, most of them empty, vague. And then, buried deep within the search results, a small mention of his family. Sophie clicked on the link, curiosity gnawing at her. The mention was brief, a news article about a tragic car accident several years ago. It was about a young man, James, who had died in the crash, and his surviving twin brother, Lucas. The details were sparse, but the name sent a jolt through Sophie's entire body. Lucas. Her heart raced. Could it be? Could Alex, Lucas, be the twin brother of James? She clicked through the article quickly, her fingers trembling as she read about the estrangement between the brothers. James and Lucas had been close once, but after a falling out years ago, Lucas had disappeared from the family's life. No one had heard from him since the accident. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She stared at the screen, the words blurring in front of her eyes. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Alex was Lucas. Tears sprang to her eyes as everything clicked into place. The resemblance, the mannerisms, the voice. It all made sense now, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. She felt betrayed, confused, heartbroken. She had to confront him. She had to know the truth. Sophie stood up abruptly, her heart pounding, her body trembling with emotion. She reached for her phone, dialing his number, the weight of everything bearing down on her. It's time for the truth. Sophie's fingers hovered over the phone screen, her heart thundering in her chest. The weight of the revelation that Alex was, in fact, Lucas, James's estranged twin brother, hung heavily in the air, suffocating her with its intensity. Her mind raced with questions. How could he have lied to her like this? Why would he go so far to deceive her? She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat making it almost impossible to speak. But she had to know the truth. She couldn't continue this twisted charade, allowing herself to be caught in the web of emotions Lucas had spun around her. She tapped the screen and waited as the phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity. When Alex finally answered, his voice was calm, almost too calm, as though he had been expecting this moment. "Sophie?" His voice was soft, but she could hear the hint of tension beneath the surface. "Are you okay?" Her pulse quickened, her anger rising like a tidal wave. She clenched her fist around the phone, her grip tight enough to make her knuckles ache. "No, I'm not okay," she snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and disbelief. "You've been lying to me, Lucas. I know who you really are." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Sophie could hear his breath hitch as if he hadn't expected her to find out so soon. She could almost picture him, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock as the truth finally came to light. But she wasn't going to back down. I didn't want to hurt you, Sophie," Lucas said quietly, the sincerity in his voice palpable. "I never meant for you to find out this way, but it's the only way I could get close to you." Sophie's breath hitched. "Close to me?" She felt her chest tighten as the confusion deepened. "Close to me?" she echoed, her voice rising. "You lied to me. You pretended to be someone you're not. And all this time, I've been talking to you, believing that you were just a man I met online, when in reality, you're my late fiancé's twin brother?" She could hear him take a deep breath, as if trying to calm himself before answering. "Yes, I'm sorry. I should have told you earlier. But when I saw you at Leo's funeral, I couldn't help myself. You were so broken, so lost, and I wanted to help you. I wanted to be there for you. I wanted to be the person who could heal that pain. But I couldn't do it as myself. I couldn't face you as Lucas because you never knew me. You only knew James. So I became someone else." Sophie's mind reeled with his words. She had suspected something all along, but hearing him admit it so openly, with such raw vulnerability, felt like a slap in the face. She had been lied to, manipulated. The trust she had built with him, however fragile, had been shattered in an instant. "You're telling me you created a fake identity, pretended to be someone you're not, just to get close to me?" Sophie's voice was strained, her anger giving way to the overwhelming sense of betrayal that surged through her veins. "Do you think I would ever have agreed to meet you if I had known the truth?" "I didn't want to hurt you," Lucas repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to be there for you, Sophie. I know I can't replace James. I know I'll never be him, but I care about you. I always have. And I thought, maybe, if I could get close enough, I could help you heal, help you move on." Sophie was silent for a moment, the weight of his confession sinking in. She felt a sick, hollow ache in her stomach, the pain of being deceived so thoroughly. She had trusted him. She had shared parts of herself with him, thinking he was someone who understood her grief, her loneliness. But it had all been a lie. "I don't know what to say," she finally muttered, her voice broken. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this." "I understand," Lucas replied, his voice thick with regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I only want you to understand that I never meant to hurt you." "I'm sorry, Sophie. I'm so sorry." But the words didn't bring her any comfort. Sophie stood there in her apartment, her phone clenched tightly in her hand, as the silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to process what had just happened. All she knew was that everything had changed, and she couldn't go back to the way things were. "Goodbye, Lucas," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Before he could respond, she ended the call, her heart pounding in her chest. She sank down onto the couch, staring blankly at the wall, trying to make sense of the chaos swirling in her mind. But there were no answers, only the painful, gnawing uncertainty of what came next. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Sophie moved through them like a ghost, her mind consumed by the conversation with Lucas, the man who had lied to her, who had used her grief as a way to get close to her. She couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop replaying the words he had said, his confession hanging over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't understand why he had done it, why he had felt the need to deceive her like that. And yet, as much as she wanted to hate him, to be angry at him, part of her understood why he had acted the way he did. He had loved James, too. They had been twins. They had shared a bond that was deeper than anyone could understand. But that didn't excuse the fact that he had used her vulnerability to get what he wanted. He had played on her grief, her loneliness, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered trust. Sophie spent her days in a haze of confusion, avoiding her phone and email, not wanting to hear from anyone, especially Lucas. But despite her efforts to shut him out, he kept trying to reach her. Texts, voicemails, emails, each one more desperate than the last, each one pleading for forgiveness. He said he understood why she was angry. He said he never meant to hurt her. But Sophie didn't know if she could believe him anymore. One evening, after yet another day of ignoring his attempts to contact her, Sophie sat on the couch with her phone in hand. She had seen the missed calls, the unread messages, but she hadn't been ready to deal with it. Not yet. But as the silence of her apartment grew louder, the weight of it unbearable, Sophie found herself staring at his number on the screen. Her thumb hovered over the message app, and for a moment she considered texting him back. Just to end the silence, just to say something. Anything. But in the end, she didn't. She couldn't. The hurt was too deep, too raw. How could she forgive him? How could she move past the lies, the betrayal? She felt empty, hollow, like a part of her had been ripped out, and there was no way to fill the void. And yet, deep down, Sophie knew that she couldn't just ignore what had happened. She couldn't pretend like nothing had changed, because everything had changed. The love she had once felt for him, however brief, had been replaced with a bitter sense of betrayal. And no matter how much she wished it could be different, no matter how much she longed to believe that Lucas was truly sorry, Sophie knew that the trust between them had been broken beyond repair. And so she closed her eyes, letting the tears fall. And for the first time since she had met Lucas, Sophie allowed herself to grieve. Not just for James, but for the person she had lost in the process, herself. The silence that had settled between Sophie and Lucas was deafening. For an entire week, Sophie avoided him with a determination she didn't know she was capable of. She couldn't bear to face him again, couldn't bring herself to answer his constant messages, his pleading phone calls. Every notification from him sent a wave of nausea through her stomach, and she had long since muted his contact. It was the only way she could manage to get through each day. In the quiet moments when her mind wasn't consumed by the noise of the world, she found herself thinking of him. Of Lucas. She couldn't shake the memory of his voice, the way he had sounded when he admitted the truth. He hadn't been angry. He hadn't been defensive. Instead, he had sounded regretful, sorrowful, as though he genuinely cared. But that didn't change what he had done. She couldn't forget the lie, the manipulation, the deceit. And as much as she wanted to understand him, to find some way to forgive him, she just couldn't. Sophie found herself pacing through her apartment, running her fingers along the edge of the furniture as though trying to ground herself. She couldn't stay still, her thoughts constantly spinning. The betrayal ran deep, cutting through the fragile trust she had managed to rebuild after James's death. And now, after everything she had been through, there was nothing left but the hollow echo of disappointment. She had let her guard down once more, only to be deceived again. The apartment was quieter than usual. The sounds of the outside world, cars, people, the faint hum of the city, felt muffled. She felt as though she were in a bubble, trapped within her own grief, her own sadness, her own heartache. The air seemed heavy, thick with the weight of the emotions she had tried so hard to avoid. There were moments when Sophie wanted to cry, to scream, to just let everything out. But when she looked in the mirror, all she saw was a woman who had been broken once, only to have someone else break her all over again. She had trusted Lucas. He had been the one person she had allowed herself to lean on after James. And now, she was alone again, just like she had been before. Alone with her memories, with her pain. A part of Sophie knew she couldn't keep running away from this. She couldn't keep living in this limbo, caught between the grief of losing James and the betrayal of Lucas. She had to face the truth. She had to confront the reality of what had happened, even if it meant accepting that her feelings for Lucas, however real they had seemed, were built on a lie. The phone on the coffee table buzzed again. Another message from Lucas. Sophie stared at it for a long moment, her chest tightening. She couldn't bring herself to read it. The pain was too fresh, too raw. And yet, deep inside, there was a part of her that wanted to forgive him. A part that wanted to believe the person she had known in their conversations. The man who had comforted her, who had made her laugh, who had shared his own pain with her. That person was real, wasn't he? But no matter how much she wanted to believe in him, Sophie couldn't ignore the fact that Lucas had crossed a line, one that couldn't be erased. A week had passed, but the wound was still too deep, still too fresh to even think about healing. She didn't know if she could ever go back. She didn't know if she could ever trust him again. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring her coffee. The sun had begun to set outside, casting a soft golden glow through the window, but the warmth of the light didn't reach her. It had been a week since she had last spoken to Lucas, and in that time, she had tried to bury herself in work, in distractions, in anything that would keep her mind occupied. But the silence had only grown louder. Every second without him felt like an eternity. As she stared out the window, lost in thought, the sound of a knock on the door startled her. She froze, unsure of who could be visiting. No one had come by, not since the fallout with Lucas. Not since she had decided to shut herself off from everyone. Hesitantly, she stood up, her heart racing as she walked toward the door. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and yet, deep down, a part of her feared who might be on the other side. When she opened the door, there he was, Lucas. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't move. She wanted to shut the door, to send him away, but something in his eyes made her pause. He looked different, more vulnerable than she had ever seen him, his face drawn with an expression of regret and guilt that made her heart ache. He was standing there, holding a small bouquet of flowers, the kind that seemed so out of place for a man who had deceived her. The gesture was almost too much, too raw, too real. "Sophie," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk?" For a long moment, Sophie didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at him, her emotions warring inside her. Her instinct was to shut the door in his face, to turn her back on him once and for all. But something in his eyes, a quiet desperation, a vulnerability that mirrored her own, made her hesitate. "What do you want, Lucas?" Her voice was quiet, but the pain in it was undeniable. "You've said everything there is to say. You've lied to me. You've broken my trust. What else is there to talk about?" He swallowed hard, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know I can't undo what I've done. I know I can't erase the hurt I've caused you, Sophie. But I need you to hear me out. Please. Just let me explain." Sophie closed her eyes, the exhaustion of the past week settling heavily on her shoulders. She had spent so many days avoiding this moment, dreading the inevitable confrontation that had been hanging over her like a storm cloud. But now, here he was, standing on her doorstep, offering her the one thing she didn't know if she could give him, a chance to explain. With a deep breath, she stepped back and opened the door wider, allowing him to enter. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew that she couldn't keep running from the truth. Not anymore. As Lucas stepped inside, Sophie couldn't help but wonder what this moment would bring. Would she find closure, or would it only open old wounds, making the healing process even harder? She didn't know. All she knew was that, for better or worse, she was about to hear the truth. Lucas sat down on the couch, the space between them feeling miles apart. Sophie lingered near the kitchen, her arms crossed over her chest, her stance protective. She was trying to brace herself for what was coming, but nothing could fully prepare her for the weight of his confession. He looked at her, His eyes filled with so much regret that it almost seemed like he might break down any second. "Sophie, I never meant for any of this to happen," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I know that's not enough to make up for everything I've done, but please understand, I wasn't trying to deceive you just to hurt you. I thought I was helping." Sophie remained silent, watching him carefully. Her heart was a battlefield. The man sitting before her, the one who had lied and manipulated her emotions, was also the same man who had shared so many intimate conversations with her over the past few months. The man who had made her laugh when she thought she would never smile again. The man who had in many ways become her confidant, the person she turned to when she was at her lowest. Lucas continued, his voice faltering. "I hadn't seen Leo in years. We didn't speak for so long. He was the better son, the one my parents adored. But I was always so lost, so angry at him for everything that I couldn't do. And when I saw you at his funeral, I felt like I had lost him all over again. You were the last person I expected to see there, and you were grieving so profoundly that it broke me. I wanted to reach out to you, but I knew it wasn't right." Sophie's eyes softened slightly as she listened. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, the pain that seemed to resonate in every word he spoke. She could see how much the loss of his brother had affected him, how deeply his guilt was rooted. But the betrayal still stung. "I didn't know what to do," he went on. "I didn't want to be a stranger to you. I didn't want you to feel like you were grieving alone. So I created a profile, a new identity, hoping that I could be someone you could lean on, someone who would help you move forward without you knowing who I really was. I thought if you could just talk to me, maybe it would be easier for you to heal." Sophie's heart ached at the complexity of his feelings. She had never considered the depths of Lucas's own internal struggle, how much of his pain had driven him to make the choices he did. But in the same breath, she could never ignore the fact that he had chosen to deceive her, to lie to her for months. It felt like a betrayal, not just of her trust, but of the memory of Leo himself. "I know I've destroyed any chance of you ever forgiving me," Lucas said, his voice breaking. "But I just wanted you to know, I never meant to hurt you. I thought if I could somehow help you heal, I could make up for all the years I lost with Leo. But I was wrong. I was selfish." Sophie's emotions were swirling inside her, but she kept her voice steady. "It wasn't just your lies, Lucas. It was the fact that you pretended to be someone you weren't, someone who was supposed to be my lifeline. You were the person I trusted the most, and then I found out you were someone else entirely." Her eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them away. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." Lucas looked down, his face filled with shame. "I don't deserve forgiveness, Sophie. But I wanted to be honest with you, to at least tell you why I did what I did. I never wanted to replace Leo. He was my brother, and I loved him. I wanted to honor his memory, and I wanted to honor you too. You were the woman he loved, and I thought maybe I could help you somehow. I never meant for it to go this far. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Sophie's heart was breaking, torn between the truth of his words and the overwhelming pain his actions had caused. She had spent so much time in this emotional limbo, trying to make sense of everything. Now, hearing the depth of his remorse, it was as though a part of her was finally able to exhale. But forgiveness was not something she could give away so easily. Not yet. "You've hurt me, Lucas," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to move past that." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "But I'm willing to try. For me. Not for you. Not for Leo, but for me." Lucas's face softened, his eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and sorrow. "I'll do whatever it takes, Sophie. If you need space, I'll give it to you. If you need time, I'll wait. Just know that I'm here. And I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry." Sophie looked at him, the weight of his words hanging heavy between them. She didn't know where this path would lead. She didn't know if she would ever fully trust him again, or if their relationship would ever go beyond the fragile beginnings they had started with. But for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but learning how to live with it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of quiet reflection for Sophie. She didn't have the answers she was looking for, but she was beginning to find peace in the uncertainty. Lucas had been patient, giving her the space she needed, and over time, they began to rebuild their connection. Slowly, carefully. They would meet for coffee, sometimes for a walk in the park, each conversation tentative at first, but gradually becoming more comfortable. It wasn't easy. There were days when Sophie found herself angry all over again, consumed by the memories of betrayal. But there were other days when she felt something lighter, something softer, the flicker of the connection they had once shared. Maybe it wasn't the same as it had been before, but it was something new, something worth exploring. Lucas was different now, more open, more vulnerable. He had stopped hiding behind the facade of the man he had once pretended to be. And Sophie? Sophie was learning how to be honest with herself, how to acknowledge her own pain, and how to give herself the time she needed to heal. They talked about Leo, about the life he had once shared with them both. They spoke about the future, tentatively at first, but gradually with more certainty. Sophie wasn't sure what the future held, or whether their relationship could ever be what it might have been if not for the lies. But she knew one thing: she was stronger now, more whole than she had been before. And for the first time in a long while, Sophie allowed herself to believe in new beginnings, ones that weren't built on perfection, but on the messy, complicated reality of love and forgiveness. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was enough. The end, or perhaps a new beginning. The story between Sophie and Lucas was never an easy journey. From deep wounds to betrayal and hurt, they faced emotions that many might never overcome. But through every small step, each conversation, and each moment facing painful truths, they found a new path forward. Sophie didn't need to completely forget the past, but she learned to make peace with it. And with Lucas, the truth wasn't just about restoring trust. It was about allowing her heart to open, learning to love again, not just others, but herself. Lucas, in confronting his deep guilt, eventually found a way to make amends, not through words of apology or regret, but through actions and patience, by waiting and respecting Sophie's decisions. He didn't try to replace Leo, but instead chose to be a part of her healing journey. Each step they took wasn't perfect, but what mattered was that they found their own way, a path where they could face the past without letting it control them and open their hearts to the future. This story is not just about love and forgiveness. It's about resilience, about how we grow stronger through challenges, and how sometimes the hardest relationships help us understand ourselves better. And so, the story of Sophie and Lucas ends not with a clear conclusion, but with a new beginning. A beginning not based on perfection, but on acceptance and growth. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end of this journey. I truly appreciate you taking the time to hear this story unfold, and I hope it resonated with you in some way. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that like button. Your support means the world to me. And if you'd like to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on any future content. Feel free to leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, thank you again for watching, and I look forward to bringing you more amazing stories.